President Trump says a potential deal with Iran would be, quote, far better than former President Obama's 2015 agreement. But there's a catch. He needs to get Tehran back to the negotiating table. Today, in an interview with Bloomberg, Trump said it's highly unlikely that he would extend the truce with Iran before it expires on Wednesday evening. Sources tell CNN Vice President J.D. Vance is set to travel to Pakistan for a second round of peace talks, but Tehran says it has no plans to participate. In fact, the regime is vowing retaliation after American forces fired on and seized an Iranian-flagged cargo ship known as the Tuska after it tried to bypass the U.S. blockade. U.S. Central Command sharing this video you see here of yesterday's operation, which shows U.S. Marines on helicopters rappelling down and boarding the ship. CNN's Nic Robertson is live for us from Islamabad in Pakistan. Nick, it is unclear if this new round of talks is actually even going to happen. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think at the moment the struggle to get the Iranians to commit to come to the table is going to be about as big an effort as it will be then, should they get to the table, to try to bring agreement around the table. I think there's real hope, certainly from the mediators, from Pakistan's perspective, that if they can get Iran to the table, J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, when they arrive in Pakistan, if the Iranians can get to the table, then the mediators really feel that there is a deal that can be done. So I think in that context, there's some positivity. In the background, of course, there is diplomacy going on, trying to reach out to the Iranians, trying to convince them to come. Conversations, obviously, between Pakistani and U.S. officials at various different levels. But at the moment, the core issue for the Iranians really is the Strait of Hormuz. Last week, when Pakistan's sort of top negotiator, who was also the most powerful man in the country, Field Marshal Asim Munir, was in Tehran, there was a real sort of series of confidence-building measures going on. You had the ceasefire in Lebanon. You had the Iranians opening up the Strait of Hormuz. They got disappointed when President Trump decided to keep the U.S. closure of the Strait of Hormuz in place. The Iranians fired on ships. The United States overnight fired on, as you were mentioning, on that Iranian tanker. That's sort of given the hardliners in Iran over the past 48 hours a much sort of stronger messaging than they had previously. But the lead negotiator, Ghalibaf, who's the speaker in the Iranian parliament, is still seen as a key interlocutor. If he can and does come to Pakistan, that he can sit at the table and with sort of authority have that serious negotiation across the table. So at the moment, everyone here is waiting for the Iranians to signal they're coming. You know, it could come late tonight, it could come early tomorrow morning. But obviously, if it doesn't come sort of by the middle of the day or early afternoon local time tomorrow, then therefore, what would be the point of J.D. Vance getting on a plane and coming here? So I think that's the sort of time frame we're looking into here. Of course, this city's ready, security is in place, hotels are ready, vacated, ready for the two teams to come in. The talks venues all sorted, super secure around there. I was down there in that area today. So it's all set and ready to go. It's waiting on the Iranians, and can they be convinced to come? I think the hope is the answer is yes, but until they sign on, it's still a guess.
Yeah, certainly is. Nic Robertson, thank you for the very latest. Omar?
Let's talk about this more with retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. So, look, I just want to start with the Strait of Hormuz. It's largely deserted at this point in terms of that main portion. What current threats do ships looking to pass through face here?
Well, Omar, some of the threats include the mines, obviously, the possible mines that the Iranians may have dispersed, but they're also looking at the mine-laying shipcraft that are there. The vessels that they use are vessels that have not only speed, but also they're small enough that they actually go outside of the bounds of a lot of what the Navy sees on, the U.S. Navy would see on their radars, for example. So they've got these fast boats that the Iranians have. They've got mines. They've got shore batteries that they could potentially use, and they've got missiles. So the Iranians have this panoply of things that they could potentially use against any type of shipping that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And the way the Iranians have described it, they only want ships to go through the channels that they've approved, not the previously used international channels.
And, as we typically see in wars and conflicts like these, obviously what happens on the battlefield, what happens kinetic-wise, militarily, affects or impacts what happens on the diplomatic side of things in terms of leverage, what's discussed, things like that. And as the U.S. works towards a second round of talks with Iran, has the blockade and the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, for example, removed any cards from Iran's negotiating table? How do you see the U.S. actions having impacted what they can offer?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, Omar. When you look at the U.S. blockade against Iranian shipping, that blockade is actually a fairly significant development, because what it's doing is it's constraining Iran's freedom of movement and the Iranian ability to not only move their ships, but also to have cargo come in and out of the country. So that affects their ability to gain revenue from oil sales, for example. When it comes to the Lebanon aspect, the idea that there is a ceasefire of sorts between the Israelis and Lebanon, that is a positive thing. That's seen as a positive thing also by Iran. So as far as the cards that Iran has, the U.S. blockade has removed at least one card from the Iranian deck, but the ceasefire with Lebanon actually goes in Iran's favor, and it's part of really the mix that Iran wants to achieve in this particular case.
So I want to bring in Ian Bremmer. He's the president and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Thanks for taking the time. Good to see you. Look, usually it's the details of any ceasefire negotiations that are the sticking points, and here we've got Iranian officials saying there are no immediate plans for a second round of talks, yet the latest reporting is Vance is expected to head there for a second round of talks to Pakistan. Is this just posturing? What do you make of this dynamic?
Probably, in the sense that there's good reason for the Iranians to want the ceasefire to hold. They're also trying to show that they have more leverage. They want this to be the Americans requesting the Iranians to have talks. They don't like the Americans acting like they have all the cards. Certainly the biggest moves over the last few days has been the U.S. imposing the blockade and then boarding an Iranian ship after firing on it. So the latest rounds of escalation have been more on the U.S. side than on the Iranian side. I see this as Iran looking to have more influence before talks occur. But I would be surprised if the talks fell apart before they happen.
So let's assume, let's go with that. Let's assume the second round of talks materializes. That's what we end up seeing this week. Where do you believe realistically these talks could actually end up? Because a lot of the discussion is just over reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That doesn't really get to the root of sort of nuclear proliferation, uranium enrichment levels. We sort of feel a long way from that. But do you think that could even be included in this next round?
So there are a number of issues of potential conflict here that have been taken off the table. Regime change, Trump has basically said, wasn't a goal, and it's already a new regime. Don't need to worry about that. Ballistic missiles, a big demand of the Israelis and the Gulf states. Trump has privately told Gulf leaders that should be an issue that's discussed by the regional conflict, by the regional parties. We're not going to have that as part of our negotiation. Iranian support for proxies. America hasn't been engaged in that issue either. So several of the, in principle, war demands are not even necessary for the Iranians to engage with to get to yes. That leaves the issue of transit of the Strait and nuclear material. Nuclear material has been really where most of the energy has been used in the first round of talks, and there's been movement by both sides. It looks like the Iranians are prepared to accept, at least in principle, that all of the stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium would be removed from Iran. And exactly where it would go and whether it's, sort of what territory and how that would be done, those are details that need to be worked out. But in principle, it would go away. It doesn't require the Americans to militarily go in and take them. Then there's the question of ongoing enrichment. The Americans are saying there can be no ongoing enrichment for 20 years. The Iranians appear to be willing to accept that, as opposed to the old Obama deal, which had some lower level enrichment that the Iranians could engage in. But then for how long? And the Americans are saying 20 years. The Iranians, depending on what day you're talking to them and who's engaged in the talks, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. But there's been movement there. And that's an area you could see some agreement. So the idea that there's been, that these two sides are super far apart, they're actually much closer than you would have expected back when the Americans broke off the negotiations and the supreme leader and many other leaders were assassinated.
Yeah, while all of this is happening, there are a lot of places around the world sort of making contingency plans for lesser, at the very least more expensive fuel while this is going on. And one part of the world in particular is China. Almost 40% of the oil that typically passes through the Strait heads to Chinese ports. And Chinese leader Xi Jinping obviously calling for the Strait to reopen. They're not quite as affected in the day-to-day in terms of worrying about fuel shortages. But I just wonder, what do you see as China's influence here or their role on the side of these talks?
Not all that much. The Chinese and the Pakistanis a few weeks ago announced this 5-point plan to clear out the conflict in the Strait. And then the Chinese backed away from it. You have seen Chinese leadership talk about 4 overarching principles, talking about sovereignty and security, mutual respect for the territorial integrity of all of these countries. But you would not say that they are playing an active role in the negotiations the way Pakistan is. And I think a big part of that is not the Chinese not wanting responsibility for talks that they feel have a good chance of ultimately not leading to an implemented deal. So yes, they of course want to see the straits cleared up. And they're not as affected economically as many other countries are, specifically in Asia, because their stockpiles are so much greater, their reserves are so much greater than many of these countries are. They're not going to run out of core commodities in the coming weeks the way we might see in many other countries in Asia, Southeast Asia, and around the world. But I don't see the Chinese at this point playing a fundamental role in bringing the conflict to a close.